it'd be great to hear a little bit more about Trusted Server and kind of what trends you noticed and contributions from the publishing ecosystem came about to help develop this initiative.
Publishers are in a tough spot. It's not easy I would say, this is one of the hardest times in media history where being a publisher is really tough. Everything from traffic impacts from the rise of LLMs and chatbots to loss of signal in the open web ecosystem. So the Trusted Server was born out of the fact that we're seeing the signal loss, whether it's third-party cookie deprecation or future plans around things like potentially approving or blocking third-party network calls in the browser.
Welcome to the PubWay podcast. Each episode will showcase a conversation with a leader from the publishing world. If you're working at a publisher, a DSP or SSP, or you're just curious about the media industry and want to sit down and pick the brains of the experts from within the publishing space, then this is the show for you.
Hello, and welcome to the PubWay podcast. My name is Tina Yanakino.
And I'm Mike Villalobos. And in today's episode, we're going to be diving into innovation, but not just any part of innovation. It's going to be within AdTech and how it's actually opening up kind of opportunities for open source solutions, privacy standards, diving a little bit more to CTV measurement, and of course, looking at the monetization within different devices and how that looks across the industry. I think as we navigate through these shifting changes in regulations, it's important to explore different options. And we're really going to hone in today on the IAB Tech Lab and the standardization and innovation they've helped both publishers and AdTech partners alike really kind of solve for the future.
And to help us navigate these waters is none other than the CEO of IAB Tech Lab, Tony Katsur. How are you today, Tony?
Good. Thank you for having me today on the podcast. Appreciate it.
Of course. And before we dive into all the fun topics, I'd love for you to give a brief overview of your role at IAB Tech Lab, your career, just to give a little context to the audience.
Sure. So for those that may not be familiar with the IAB Tech Lab, we are the global technical standard setting body for the digital media economy. Our remit is truly global. So our members come from all walks of life across the globe. We have about 1,100 global member companies, and we have about 3,300 individuals that represent those global member companies. Work that your audience will be familiar with are things like OpenRTB protocol, the video ad serving template, better known as VAST. We partner closely with IAB Europe on the TCF, the Transparency and Consent Framework, which effectively is the technical governance for GDPR compliance in Europe. So those are just some of the standards that we oversee for the industry. I've been in the digital advertising industry for going on I'm approaching 28 years. I hesitate to say that. I've been in all manner of ad tech and publishing. So I've worked at publishers. I've worked at various ad technology companies, including DoubleClick, pre-Google acquisition. I was at Rubicon Project pre-IPO, now more formally known as Magnite. I was been at companies such as MediaMath, the early days of creating the DSPs. And then prior to me joining the Tech Lab, I was in charge of digital corporate development and strategy for Nexstar Media Group, which is the largest local broadcaster in the United States. I joined the Tech Lab in August of 2021. So I've been here for about 3.5 years. And it's been an absolute fantastic ride, just through how the industry has been very receptive to the work we've been doing over the past several years. I think Tech Lab is more relevant than ever to the ecosystem, given the developments in privacy, future of identity, addressability, the ongoing growth of connected television, its convergence with linear, the measurement challenges that represents. I know we're going to dive into that a bit. The Tech Lab has just never been more relevant to the ecosystem. So our membership has been very supportive of the work we've done. I have an incredible team, a fantastic board of directors. It's kind of a dream gig. So I'm enjoying it immensely.
That's awesome. And I guess it's safe to say you know where the bodies are buried because you've seen quite a few different iterations of ad tech. I mean, Rubicon Project is a throwback and a half. If you know, you know type deal. And also DoubleClick pre-Google is also kind of a flex, if I'm being honest.
Well, even prior to that, I was actually Net Gravity. So I was
okay.
I was actually in Net Gravity. One would argue the godfather of ad serving, Tom Shield.
Yes.
So I was at Net Gravity, which was acquired then by DoubleClick.
The true wild, wild west.
Literally, though. When everyone thought programmatic wasn't going to be a thing, and the internet was still questioned. But I think, look, the IAB Tech Lab has, I think, always advocated for open source solutions, and with Trusted Server coming about, I would love to hear more around, how does open source development actually benefit the ecosystem? And are there any risks that you see with open source?
So, I mean, yeah, we've always been a big champion of open source, and I would be remiss if I also didn't call out Prebid. They've been a staunch. I mean, they are an open source initiative. So, Mike Rasick and the team over there are doing. We're immensely supportive of their work and how they empower publishers to, pursue their monetization strategies as they see fit through their open source solutions. The beauty of open source is that it does a couple of things. It creates network effects in the sense that everyone can contribute to an open source code base or a set of technical standards and guidelines that create a rising tide for an industry. It helps bring alignment around sets of standards to allow for interoperability in an ecosystem. You may not think of these things as open source because historically they're not, but when you think of things like, how the internet functions, right? Like that was done in a very open technical standard sort of way. DNS, HTTP, TCP/IP. Yeah, they were developed in laboratories, and then brought to an ecosystem for then various private and public institutions to agree upon how those standards would work and interoperate. And boom, you have the internet. Like the internet is the perfect example of how open sourcing something would work. The growth of the web we would not be here without things like the Apache Foundation, right? That's just, we would not be here with things like MySQL, open source database solutions. So I think when you see the power of open source, just, it's the internet, like just look at the internet, right? And the beauty of creating standards around an ecosystem, drive things like Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi works pretty much everywhere. Any airport, any house, apartment, hotel, you connect to the Wi-Fi and it just works. USB is another great example. So that's the beauty of open technical standards, is that it creates this layer where no one has to figure out innovation at this very low layer, but you can innovate on top of those open technical standards or those open source frameworks. So we are massive proponents of that. I think the risk with open source can be sometimes you can't necessarily move as fast because you're looking to seek not necessarily consensus, but you're looking to seek maturity, approval, and majority support for a technical path forward. So sometimes you can get bogged down in who's advocating for what technical approach is the most sound. And sometimes that can slow things down. But I think that is a small price to pay for what open source has brought the world in the last 25 years.
Yeah, and I think for how IAB is helping kind of shape these open source projects, it'd be great to hear a little bit more about the latest initiative around Trusted Server and kind of what trends you noticed and contributions from the publishing ecosystem came about to help develop this initiative.
Well, the Trusted Server really rose out of conversations I had first and foremost with publishers, and then other members of the ad technology ecosystem. And it was really derived from what we're seeing in the form of signal loss at the user agent level. So user agent can be a browser, user agent can be an app OS like Android or iOS. And publishers are in a tough spot. It's not easy being, I would say, this is one of the hardest times in media history where being a publisher is really tough. Everything from, traffic impacts from the rise of LLMs and chatbots to loss of signal in the open web ecosystem. So the Trusted Server was born out of the fact that, we're seeing the signal loss, whether it's third-party cookie deprecation or future plans around things like potentially approving or blocking third-party network calls in the browser. There's talk of encrypting DNS, like just further limitations in terms of how publishers can aggregate signal in order to have some form of addressable advertising offering to the brands that they work with. That's what gave rise to the internet to begin with. And the fact that the internet is so ad subsidized is because of the addressability it affords. But then further than that is where browsers really started to move into, there's proposals currently in the W3C. There's also the current privacy sandbox proposal. There's what Safari's currently doing from an attribution perspective. And that's where I think the browsers have really gone kind of beyond their skis, beyond their remit. Attribution can often be a very complex topic. It's often decided between the publisher and the buyer, whether that's the agency or the brand directly. Like, how do you attribute a campaign? And it's the cornerstone for media investment, not just digital media investment, all media investment. Attribution powers investment in linear television, out of home, direct mail, print.
Well, it validates the assumption that actually something's actually working, right?
Like the brand with their agency partners, like, well, what worked? What drove performance? That's attribution, right? And so the fact that the browsers are starting to step into that, and there's proposals that your listeners can go read at the W3C. You can go dig into ARA as part of Sandbox and Apple's approach to attribution, where I think they're beyond their remit there. That is another limiting factor where, you're trying to pigeonhole an entire ecosystem into something that is very complex and something that is ultimately simplified in the name of privacy. I think their goal is, one could argue that, greater consumer privacy is a good thing, but the means by which we achieve that can perhaps impact advertising utility. So how do we find that balance? So as we saw greater kind of encroachment on publishers' ability to make money, to monetize their content, we were like, what's a fallback mechanism if browsers continue to constrain those environments, thus further limiting publishers' ability to effectively monetize? And that's where Trusted Server came from, is what is the fallback position we can create? It's not a mandate to put everything into the server ecosystem, right? But as things are constrained in the browser, how can we revert back to a publisher owned and operated, or publisher owned and operated, maybe third party managed publisher environment, either on the CDN edge and their cloud environment for those publishers that are still running, hard iron and owned and operated data centers. That's where the Trusted Server was born from. It's about moving the signaling, the transactioning into a server-side environment. So that was the impetus for it. But then as we started to walk down developing the prototype, we started to find all these other ancillary, kind of obvious benefits. And these aren't new concepts to the industry. It's been talked about for years about a server-side approach to advertise. But benefits are less tags on the page, less third-party network calls on the page. So you're looking at faster page load times, which good user experience. Faster page load time should also improve things like viewability scores because the page will render that much faster. You're looking at slight tweaks in terms of session times for publishers. So session times can increase. So faster page load times, everyone wins. That is a win-win for everyone: consumers, publishers, and their advertisers. And then because the Trusted Server does everything under the first-party publisher domain, there's also beneficial side effects like makes ad blocking a lot more difficult. So depending on who your research partner is for what the percentages of ad blocking, it's 20 to 40%, depending on what you read.
Big delta, but yep.
Yeah.
Big delta, depending on who your source of truth is. There's immediate revenue recovery here potentially from an ad blocking perspective. Now, ad blocking is always going to be building a better mousetrap or nuclear arms race. So I could certainly see the ad blockers taking other avenues to try and block the ads, but it does make it a bit more difficult. So we started to look at all these other benefits to publishers and consumers in terms of, what would happen if we moved as much of the ecosystem to the server side as possible, and Trusted Server was born.
Love it. I think Trusted Server being, we're referencing a lot, but open source. How do you maintain security, right? I think like the security, also standardization, I think are two really big kind of components that can really stand this whole thing up. How do you make sure that it's going to be maintained, like the whole standard across the board? Is there any concerns with that? Or is it just like as you mentioned on the risk side, you kind of wait and move a little slower than usual just to make sure it's being adopted so the standardization actually takes place?
It's a good question. What you refer to as security, we've been calling since our internal conversations last summer on this within the Tech Lab, we refer to as integrity.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
I like it better, to be honest.
How do you, right? Like the benefits, historically the benefits of being in the browser is that the browser is inherently transparent, right? You can inspect the network calls, you can inspect the code on page. So there's a lot of transparency that does come with the browsers. where, there's downside also, right? Like, again, there is just too much JavaScript on the page. There are too many third-party network calls on the page. It's not a great user experience, right? So there's trade-offs in everything. And I think the benefit of the browsers with the transparency piece, moving things server side, now you're making calls in a multi-threaded server environment, right? So much more performant. That results in things like faster load times, et cetera. But there are black box elements to a server. Like, you can't always see what's going on in the server. So the question we have been asking ourselves for a while, and we're starting to tackle now, the purpose of the prototype was just conceptually, will this work? Like, are we crazy? And that's why we did the prototype. Like, oh, wow, it works. I can actually, through an integration with Prebit Server, I can actually send a request through Prebit Server, run a programmatic auction through Prebit Server, and then have that ad delivered back to the trusted server, make the ad calls, transform the ad calls from third party to first party, and then stitch that into the DOM and send the payload, the web page, on the way to the browser. We were like, holy crap, that works. But then it was, how do we ensure things like identities that a publisher would mint, either a first party server side cookie or some other proprietary publisher owned identifier? How do we ensure the integrity of that ID and there's not ID spoofing going on? How do we ensure integrity of the impressions and there's not manufactured impressions happening on the server side? Frankly, we don't have those answers yet. Like, how do we ensure the integrity of potentially certain modules in the trusted server framework? That's where we're looking to the industry. Like, you can start with basic things like checksumming the source code, but like, it's open source. People are going to modify the source to their needs. So your checksums won't validate. Do we do things like signed modules for certain things, particularly around things like identity and preventing fraud? Do we have signed modules? So there's a whole integrity initiative that has to happen as part of this to ensure that people are comfortable with the server side. But I also don't want to what's the word I'm looking for? Stress that, because there is a massive, massive part of our ecosystem that is already server side. CTV, it's all server side. Like this. So server side isn't new to the industry. Server side happens in CTV, which I would argue has clearly, the biggest budgets are going to transition over the next decade to streaming, and it's your richest unit economics, right? So the industry already has a comfort level with server side approaches. So while we do need to work on ensuring integrity from a technical perspective as best we can, and by the way, not everything can be solved through tech standards. There are contracts, there are laws, right? Be a good
semantics. It's fine,
right? Exactly. Not everything technical frameworks, but no, integrity is like where you were going. Like, what you're calling security. We think of it as integrity. So ensuring that some components of this have very clear, well-signaled integrity of certain functionality is something that we're gonna seek to solve with the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously with cookie deprecation, privacy first solutions, server side is only going to keep becoming more and more apparent. The industry buckled down on it. And even though Lucy kind of pulled the football away with cookie deprecation yet again, shocker, everyone was already spending 5-7 years preparing for it. And users clearly prefer it. So it's not going anywhere. But I'm happy you brought up CTV. Obviously, that's like an impossible topic to avoid at any event we go to, any panel we do. But from the IAB Tech Lab's perspective, as it relates to measurement, CTV is still as an ecosystem is pretty fragmented. I guess, how are you guys kind of approaching those issues, and how are you thinking about solving for them in the next 12 to 18 months or further?
I wish it was 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, right.
CTV to me is one of two of kind of final frontiers from an environment perspective. The other to me is gaming. So when I think of channels, right? You've got open web display, you've got mobile web display, you've got mobile app video, et cetera, and then you have CTV gaming as two of those kind of pioneering areas of the ecosystem. And yeah, measurement in CTV is a challenge. I was at an Ad Week New York City dinner last fall, and it was a CTV dinner, and it was a who's who. I mean, just think of either the CTV media, think of the media company that has a massive streaming footprint, or the technology partners that support it, and even some buyers, even some brands were in the room. And the question was asked, what's the number one challenge facing the growth of CTV? And everyone said measurement. Everyone. But the challenge is it's hard to get everyone to agree on what a standardized measurement approach is to CTV. And some of that falls within Tech Lab. Some of that doesn't. Tech Lab's role in this would be to create a standardized, open technical framework to create the proper telemetry for folks to measure their CTV ad performance, whether that is just basic reach and frequency, whether that is some outcome-based approach. Like we don't take a position in the business side or debating like what should be measured. That's a business decision. And IAB, our sister organization, IAB would be more present in that conversation. But getting people to align on some technical framework to standardize measurement in CTV is where we're focused. So, it was funny when everyone was like, that's our number one challenge. I'm like, we've been trying to get everyone in a room for years to agree on this. But you're all saying it's a challenge, but no one wants to agree on what the right approach is, or at least start the baseline for a framework. But we do have initiatives that have been in market for a number of years that do normalize measurement. We have expanded those to CTV. So there's the Open Measurement SDK. We call it OMSDK for short. That was launched in 2017 it was initially launched to specifically address the call to arms that Mark Pritchard at P&G made in early 2017 around viewability. And so the Open Measurement SDK it normalized viewability metrics. It started in the mobile ecosystem. It quickly moved to web. And then we have now launched Open Measurement SDK for CTV. We launched that about 18 months ago. And that does a little bit more than your standard Open Measurement SDK around viewability. It's also measuring things like, is it a zombie television? So did you leave the TV on for your dog and go out for a while? And, there's no one watching the television. It also detects things like, is the TV on or off? So if you have, we've seen the reports where someone had some device stick plugged into their television, the content was still streamed, but the TV was actually off. The OMSDK detects those things to ensure that there is viewability around CTV viewing, and it's normalized viewability. The way we measure and capture, the way we expose measurement telemetry in the OMSDK is standardized across all environments. So you get a consistent set of data no matter where the ad is appearing. It's mobile app, mobile web, desktop, or CTV. You get consistent metrics or metricing, if that's not a word I think I just made up.
Now it is.
Consistent metricing across all of your environments. So OMSDK is one area where we have, that's been out now for, again, 18, almost to 24 months. It supports iOS, Android televisions, Samsung, LG. So at this point, we probably have about, I'd say 60% coverage, 65% coverage of the CTV landscape from a standardized measurement perspective. So that's one initiative. Another initiative is what we call the Ad Creative ID framework, which we developed in conjunction with several television networks, including NBC Universal, Paramount. We also work closely with Ad ID, which is the joint effort between 4As and the ANA. And the Ad Creative ID framework is effectively a registry and a validation framework for creative IDs, like Ad ID here in the US, or Clearcast in the UK, or ARPP in France. At last count, there's about 20, maybe 22 creative ID solutions across the globe. And some of those are mandated by governments. Like I believe ARPP in France is actually required by the French government. I'm pretty sure creative IDs are required by the UK government, which is powered by Clearcast. And the beauty of a creative ID is that follows the creative through the entire CTV ecosystem, as long as it doesn't get lost from creative agency to media buying agency into the programmatic landscape, right? If a creative is retranscoded or re-encoded, you could lose the ID. At trafficking time, the ID may not make it into the vast template. So the IDs can drop out. And what that then results in is a reconciliation challenge for publishers who spend tens of thousands of hours and therefore millions of dollars trying to reconcile potentially the same creative from the same brand across all their distribution points. So there's a real inefficiency there. It also creates a headache for agencies and their brands to understand, okay, I ran this campaign. I used this creative across all these different CTV partners. Like, did I hit my reach and frequency curve? Like, who saw it? When did they see it? How often did they see it? The ASIF is intended to kind of reinforce and validate the use of these creative ID solutions, again, AdID here in the US, Clearcast in the UK, and others, to ensure that the creative ID is in place and it's valid, right? We have a validation API that would then, if you have a creative ID, for example, in the US, and that goes into ASIF, we will make an API call to AdID, and AdID will say, yes, that is a valid AdID creative ID. That is legitimate. Continue on and traffic that off. And then the beauty of that is then all that data then goes back to AdID, and then you can get that, consistent view of where the creative ran across the CTV landscape. So that's the second initiative that we're focused on for CTV. Third, which is, I think our CTV investments are probably somewhere between 5 to 10 year time horizons, just given, I think, how long it's going to take for CTV to evolve and for audiences to shift over. So the last one is we have a grander vision for some form of open tokenization framework in the form of watermarking, audio or video watermarks, within the actual content and the ad creative. And we think that if we can get, I don't think it's so much a challenge of getting the industry to agree on what those watermarks, what those standards should be. And we're looking at, do you leverage things like SCUDdy, which already exist? Do you leverage things like ATSC3 and the signaling they're using? But it's really about getting folks to agree on, well, if we're going to use that level of signaling, how do the OEMs interact with that? How do different streaming apps interact with that type of watermarking? That's an open discussion that we're having within the Tech Lab working groups. Less of a technical issue. It's more of a business issue.
Sure. One thing I actually wanted to dive into a little bit more is when you look at the audience metrics, the composition of how to even create audiences, linear CTV, there's a massive break between, what actually is translatable in that sense. And then you have people asking for more than just genre-based, but you don't, the content bundles are given less than 10% of the time. So creating a proper audience for a channel requires transparency into delivery, but just there seems to be a lot of red tape and also hoops to jump through in order to get a standardized kind of audience metric, similar to what we do within open web. Would love to hear kind of maybe not a framework, but initial thoughts on how do you unify that across the transition into streaming. And you even touched on this earlier about the different metrics across, gaming, streaming, video, etc. I mean, people are now watching streaming across their phones more than ever, or at least broadcasting it, right? So like, how do you unify the audiences that we're used to in the open web to now match similar to the large consumption habits that we have within streaming and CTV?
That's a really big, great question.
I apologize if it was too much, but
that's where the watermarking framework comes into play. If we could get the ecosystem to align on a watermarked approach, both in content and the ad itself, now you would have a universal. Think of, if you think of watermark in television, it's almost like the cookie equivalent, right, for TV. So you now have a persistent token, but in this case, it would be a watermark, not a cookie, that would signal, if we were just take probably the most basic example. If I were to watermark an ad and then send that out across both linear, by the way, and streaming, I'm trying to remember the percentage of households now that have smart televisions. It's significant. And based on the latest numbers I looked at, I think the American consumer refreshes their TV set within the household. I think it's about every 4.5, 5 years, right? So you're constantly seeing this refresh of newer televisions entering the consumer household. Well, all of those newer televisions would have the capability to parse this watermark, right? So the OEMs, the Samsungs, the LGs, the Vizios, the onus would be on them to parse that watermark and generate some sort of call off the TV set, generate some sort of signaling off the TV set based on that. And now what you've done, if there was an opportunity for the OEMs to partner with the industry to do that, now what you've done is you've created a universal signaling framework that transcends not just streaming, but also linear, right? Because that watermark, the Scuddy watermark lives in linear today, right? The A335 watermark, which is part of ATSC3, lives in linear today. We can use that same signaling. We're not here to reinvent. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Like linear television industry has solved for this. We can repurpose that in a digital world. Now you've really unified this you've created this convergent television approach where now I can understand audiences across linear and streaming. And then as the industry continues to move towards streaming, as consumers move towards streaming, like that framework would stay in place, right? So you could create that bridge to move from linear to streaming. Again, that is a very technically solvable problem. The issue comes into the business dynamics. So if you're a television OEM and you're saying, well, you want me to start parsing this watermark and sending signal, well, what's in it for me? And the OEM has every right to ask that. Like, okay, what do I get for that? Okay, what here's my fee to do that. So it's really more the business dynamics of addressing this and not as much. There's plenty of technical work to do there, but that I think is much more straightforward than the industry just agreeing on like, this would be the business dynamics to accomplish something like that. And there is also things like TV OEM refresh times within the household, right? Not every flat screening in everyone's home, depending on the year it was manufactured, could do this. But certainly all the television sets that have been manufactured in the last 5 or 6 years can 100% parse a watermark.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, so you kind of answered my next question, which was more like the future of CTV monetization. How will that resemble kind of linear TV? It sounds like it's already kind of happening, even as we shift into more of like a programmatic model. Do you feel the same?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on, I had this conversation earlier today. I think it's going to depend on the television event. Spot buys happen today. When I think of traditional linear spot buys, like to me, that's programmatic, right? The ability that's a spot buy, right? But I don't think it doesn't necessarily supersede the upfronts, right? I think the upfronts will continue. I think the upfronts are an economic model that also fund future television programming. Like you show advertisers a pilot or a couple of episodes, and then they're like, here's my upfront money, and they use that money to go finish the season, right? So that's an economic model that I don't think is going away. I think I do have some question around live events. I don't know, depending on the live event, I don't know how many live events, if there's enough inventory for spot buying. Now, we are working on updates to the RTB protocol to better support RTB for live events. But I do question what's the inventory availability. Like the Super Bowl is sold on a sponsorship basis, and that gets sold out. Or like you're not spot buying the Super Bowl. The World Cup, same thing. You're not spot buying World Cup. You're not spot buying the World Series. So I do wonder about for massive live events, the ability, whether there'll be inventory for spot buys. Now, your average everyday Thursday night baseball game, like sure, or your Sunday, your mid-season Sunday NFL game or your mid-season Premier League game. Yeah, I think there's spot buying opportunities there. So I think RTB definitely has a role to play there. I just don't know for like the really big live events. Those are typically locked up with sponsorships. So I don't. So the long-winded answer to your question is that I don't know if the dynamics of how television's bought changes that drastically. I do think there's a lot more efficiency that could be recognized by using the RTB protocol. There is a question also of what does that mean for a lot of the legacy linear television hardware and software vendors? Like, what's their play 10 years from now when everything does go to a set of open standards like RTB, or you can even do like Guarantee Direct, which we have a technical standard for that's used heavily in digital out of home, but that could also apply to CTV as well. So I think there's also a question just for the legacy linear hardware and software ecosystem of how that plays in the future of streaming.
Yeah. And I think there's also going to be an opportunity for at least better standardization as a user, a watcher of streaming. You can be presented the same ad 4 times within a single viewing.
Yeah.
But you don't know as the watcher that the first ad was a direct buy. The second time you saw it was through open marketplace. The third time you saw it might be through a reseller. And obviously the frequency caps aren't working because it's from multiple different sources. It's like, but as a user and a normal person, you don't know that.
What if you had a persistent creative ID provided by AdID or Clearcast or others, and it was validated against the Tech Lab Ad Creative ID framework? You can mitigate those things, right? So that's the purpose of a creative ID, is to understand, like, okay, wait a minute, this was all the same advertiser, maybe even the same campaign, but like this came in as direct buy, this came in as spot, this was a PMP, like, wait a minute, right? So, but if you had a persistent creative ID, the metrics you would get back mid-campaign, you'd be like, wait a minute, we've over frequency this consumer or this device, like, what are we doing? So that's why creative IDs are so important.
Yeah.
That's a fair point. There have been numerous times where I've sat and watched like the same ad.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like I'd say it's a 2-hour movie.
Yeah.
You're going to watch at least 3 of the same brands come through, which is a little frustrating, but yeah.
It's gotten better, but there's definitely still, there's still work to be done for sure. It's gotten tremendously better, but I've had those same, I've had recent experiences where it's like, it's not just the same brand, it's the same creative. And I've seen it now. 100%. I've seen it now 17 times during a 2-hour program. Like, but that's where things like creative ID come into play.
That's fair. I think, speaking of like disparate places and sources or pockets rather, we have at this point 17 different legislations across privacy in the US.
Give or take.
Then we go GDPR. There it is. Yeah, there it is. So as that evolves and will likely become more and more complex and harder to navigate through, I guess, can you walk me through the privacy taxonomy and that whole project that you're leading, just understanding what that means for unification of legislation? Or maybe it's not. I don't know enough about it, but would love to hear, what that means for you all and how that actually impacts the publishers. Since this is obviously a publisher-focused podcast, but additionally, even on the demand side, how does that affect the AdTech ecosystem as well?
By having a privacy taxonomy, you create a shared language around privacy, which I think is critically important, right? When you are complying with local law, words matter. The words of the law matter, right? Just as much as the conversation around how you comply with that also matters. So creating, the Tech Lab privacy taxonomy isn't just a technical standard. It's a means by which disparate parties can speak the same language when they're talking about privacy compliance. So the ability to allow, buyers and publishers, their SSP partners, DSPs, agencies, and brands to categorize data on a consistent basis. So understanding the transparency and the data provenance around data that was used to power a buy, what data was held in a certain identity solution, where does that data reside, why is it being used? Enforcement of consent. So ensure everyone is aligned in terms of standardized communication around consent, right? And purposes by which data is going to be used is clearly communicated to consumers. Efficiency around privacy requests. If someone issues a data deletion request, if someone suddenly decides to remove their consent, right? Having a common taxonomy streamlines the retrieval of where that data may reside, modifying or reading that data. And then from an auditing perspective, like having a standardized taxonomy to ensure privacy compliance, whether that is by a regulator, or whether that is for self-audit or whatever other third-party audit you may be subjected to, a consistent privacy taxonomy ensures everyone is speaking the same language. And I think that is incredibly important when we're talking about legal compliance.
Yeah. And I think another important thing to note is whenever there's a industry shift for better or for worse, publishers are usually left holding the bag, or at least they feel like they're not always involved in the monetary benefits of the conversation. And with this privacy tax kind of vernacular comes up, but can you think the industry could better balance that compliance with kind of business sustainability?
Look, I think I said at our Signal Shift event, which was our addressability and privacy event 3 weeks ago in New York, privacy is good for business, right? I think as an industry, we have conflated privacy and data security into just privacy, and I think they're two actually different things. I do believe most consumers understand that there's some trade-off around, well, I'm getting this free content or service or information or investigative journalism at no cost, right? I think there either is a conscious or subconscious understanding that there's a trade-off there, right? I'm giving some information about myself to get relevant advertising, which helps pay for those journalists. So I think consumers get that. It's the clear notice. It's a clear notice and a getting consent to actually use that data. I think that's where it's critically important, right? Consumers should be given choice. Consumers, I think, are smart enough to make the choice in terms of what is in their best interest. So I think taking a privacy first approach is just good business. I think consumers appreciate it. Then there's the data security element. So once you have the data, how do you ensure that data is secured in such a way that either via malicious means or just egregious, just someone made a mistake, that if there is a data breach, the ability to get access to a consumer's PII is difficult to say the least, impossible to say the best. So I just think embracing privacy is, again, I just think it's good business. And Allison Schiff at AdExchanger wrote a good article about, well, shouldn't it just be the de facto mindset? Yeah, it should be. And I think the industry has certainly come around to that in large swaths, but it never hurts to kind of drive that message home.
Yeah, and I think we're all obviously so deep in the weeds with it, with our jobs every single day. I feel like a lot of my friends, if I asked them, they would have been like, oh, the cookie ship left the cookie dock like years ago. I have all my data the second I got a smartphone. I gave up privacy. But that's why I think it's important for us all to keep having these conversations and protecting our consumers and users.
Yeah, and I think as an industry, I think maybe we've skewed a little far to the privacy side, right? What we are trying to do at the Tech Lab and the industry overall, like every conversation I have, whether it's with a media company, an ad technology company, an agency, even, a lot of the major brands are really starting to get wise and smart about privacy. Big global brands, like it is top of mind for them. And the conversations are gravitating around, how do we thread this needle? How do we find this balance where one would argue, we've overskewed to privacy, and that's not a bad thing. Like, again, I think regulations like GDPR and the state laws that have been passed, California leading the way here in the US, like I think the industry needed to be kind of shocked into like, okay, this is an issue, right? And governments have not been happy with how the industry's self-regulated. But I think we've skewed so far in that area. How do you then bring it back to a happy middle where there is advertising utility? Because again, the web is ad subsidized, full stop, right? We would not have the internet as we know it without advertising. Wouldn't happen. And we also know subscriptions alone don't work. We've seen this. Look at every major CTV platform that was subscription on Netflix. Will never have ads. Well, lo and behold, by the way, called it 6 years ago that they would have ads. Like, clap out your subscription base at some point. Like, and you can only raise rates so much. At some point to drive growth, for a publicly held company, your shareholders want to see growth. What's your revenue growth model going to be? Well, advertising's a great way to do that. And we've seen this since the dawn of time. Like, when the New York Times was 10 cents around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, they still had ads, right? So like advertising is just part of the media model. So how do we find that happy medium between consumer privacy, obviously have to comply with the law. That's not even up for debate. And advertising utility.
I agree with that. Look, I think we can go another probably hour talking on these topics, and you've been incredibly informative. I can't thank you enough for your time here, Tony. Shifting into more personal questions, and given the fact that you are an OG of the AdTech game, would love to honestly understand what's the best and worst advice you've ever gotten, because something tells me they're going to be gems on both sides.
Best and worst advice I've ever gotten. You don't always have to have the answer for everything. I don't know it can more often than not be more credibility building than searching for an answer that you may not have. That's
I
probably
like that. What's the worst? Give me the tea.
the worst advice I've ever gotten.
You don't have to name names unless you want to. But
Worst advice I've ever gotten on a Friday night before a holiday weekend: ship it
oh no, that is the worst advice I've ever heard.
or push to production.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
I've lived that.
Wow. Okay, that's
Saturday
fair.
night, Memorial Day weekend, up at 3 a.m. because servers are down across the
Right.
lake. That's
Shit.
the worst advice I've ever gotten. Yeah, push to production. It's Friday before Memorial Day.
I'm not gonna lie. I love how you were like contemplating on the best, and as soon as I said worst, it was like a 3-second delay, and you already knew what it was.
Yeah.
You are traumatized, sir. It's okay though.
Ship it. No, I'm on call.
Too funny.
Oh, well, thank you so much again, Tony. This has been wonderful. Happy to have you back anytime.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, we can do a part 2. Happy to do it.
I love it. Well, hopefully we'll see you on the circuit, whether it be can, possible, all the things, right? But again,
Tech Lab will be a can. I will be there. Yes.
amazing. We'll have some rosé and talk shop.
Yeah, to be continued then. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.